Selamat pagi.
Selamat pagi. Yeah, I just heard from Arham that yes, you are able to speak in bahasa. Terima kasih sudah bergabung dengan acara kami di pagi hari ini.
Sama-sama. Terima kasih banyak.
Right. So, yeah, before we start, please allow me also invite Bapak Arham Maurya as our moderator for our second session. And before I got started, please allow me to inform you that Arham Maurya is a full-time lecturer of English Education Study Program at IKIP Siliwangi. He graduated from Flinders University, Australia, with a Master of Art degree in teaching English as a second language. Aside his activities as a lecturer, he is in various English courses, mainly for the task preparation for the International Education Center or ILEC in Bandung, and he has been certified as an IELTS teacher trainer by British Council Indonesia. He also worked as a part-time as an online tutor for the English Literature Study Program at Indonesia Open University, and has been involved in field supervisor in Kampus Mengajar, program initiated by the Indonesian Ministry of Education, Culture, Research, and Technology. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over the microphone to Pak Arham.
Okay, thank you to Patrice for the time and introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests of ILEC 2023, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to the second keynote session of the third International Language Education Conference of IKIP Siliwangi 2023. My name is Arham Maurya and I will be the moderator for the session. First of all, I would like to greet our honorable keynote speaker, Dr. Michelle Kohler from the University of South Australia. Halo Michelle, selamat pagi dari Bandung.
Selamat
Ya.
pagi semua.
Ya, bagaimana kabarnya?
Maaf?
How are you doing today?
Ya, baik.
Baik, oke ya. Mudah-mudahan kami tidak terlalu mengganggu liburnya ya.
Ya, tidak.
Oke,
Ini lebih menarik ya.
Okay, thank you. Okay, dear participants, before we listen to her presentation, please allow me to read out a brief bio of Dr. Michelle Kohler. Michelle Kohler is a Senior Research Fellow at the Research Center for Languages and Cultures, University of South Australia. Her areas of expertise include second language teaching and learning, intercultural mediation, and languages curriculum design and assessment. She is the author of Developing Intercultural Language Learning and Teachers as Mediators in the Foreign Language Classroom. Michelle is the immediate past president of the Applied Linguistics Association of Australia and a member of the Intercultural Mediation Research Network, International Association of Applied Linguistics. Before the presentation begins, I would like to inform you that Dr. Michelle Kohler will have about 45 minutes to present material and answer your questions. During the presentation, you may write your questions in the chat box. By the way, do you mind if the questions are asked in Indonesian, Michelle?
Ya, mungkin bahasa campur.
Campur ya, oke.
Bilingual ya. Kalau terlalu kompleks ya, mungkin.
Yes, okay, yeah. For more complex questions, maybe in English, yeah.
Terserah.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, for information, as you may have noticed, Dr. Michelle Kohler also speaks Indonesian very well. Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, I think without further ado, please allow me to kindly invite Dr. Michelle Kohler to deliver her presentation entitled "Rethinking English in Indonesia Through a Multilingual and Intercultural Perspective." Dr. Michelle Kohler, the floor is yours.
Let's start. Okay, so thank you for the invitation to contribute today, and to the organisers for all the hard work that I know goes on behind the scenes. And thank you for this very important and very relevant topic in today's society. So before I begin, I'd like to just explain briefly what my background is so that you know where I'm coming from in today's talk. So I am not actually a specialist in TESOL or in English language teaching. I'm actually a teacher of BIPA, and really my area of interest is in language education policy, and particularly in curriculum, assessment and pedagogy. So I work largely within I do work within a multilingual and intercultural orientation, and I'll outline some of that in my talk today. And I tell you this because my primary concern is not English language teaching per se, but rather it's how we teach, learn and assess languages, any language, in diverse contexts. So in my talk today, can I move it forward? There we go. In my talk today, what I'd like to do is just give a little bit of context about how I see English in the world, English in Indonesia, and then outline what we refer to in Australia as a multilingual and an intercultural orientation, with a set of principles that can inform all aspects of practice, and I'll explain that a little later. Then I'm going to briefly touch on a little example to show you how this looks in practice, and then to think about what some of the implications of this orientation for ELT in Indonesia, and what it might mean to actually have ELT for Indonesia. And I'll conclude on that point. So let's begin by considering the place of English in the world broadly, just to set the scene. So the teaching and learning of English is firmly associated with processes of globalization and internationalization. It is a multi-million-dollar business, as I'm sure you're aware, and you can see just one stat here, almost $20 billion in US dollars in 2022. So the rise over the 20th century, in particular, of the nation state and the increasingly extensive and rapid movement of goods, capital, labour, people, ideas and technologies characterises globalisation. And the dominant linguistic character of this phenomenon is that it's primarily conducted in English. In order to participate in this global economy and community, English is regarded as essential. It's typically assumed that every global citizen must learn English. It's the gateway to economic opportunity and privileges associated with being international, such as the free movement and access to cultural resources and spaces. Whether you are indeed an international business person or a lay person, English represents the communicative means and the symbolic capital necessary to participate in modern life. Governments around the world have recognised this and developed policies, regulations and strategies to ensure their citizens are equipped with English. Furthermore, in many cases, the general population, particularly those with economic aspirations, and that's many, are demanding that governments act to ensure access to English language learning. So, what does this look like in Indonesia? Indonesia has an interesting relationship with English. I won't dwell too much on this because I'm sure you probably know this better than I do, the history of English in Indonesia, but I just want to briefly outline it so that you see where I'm coming from. So English was first introduced in Indonesia in the university sector in 1949 with the establishment of the English language program at Universitas Nasional Jakarta. The choice of English at the time was largely ideological because it wasn't associated with former colonizers, the Dutch or the Japanese. Later, President Suharto regarded English as necessary for strong economic ties with the West, and during his presidency, English departments grew from 15 to 106, and I'm sure it's many more now. But Indonesia has never had a policy of wholesale English medium of instruction in education, favouring instead the national language, particularly since independence. This position has attracted both criticism and praise. For some, it has enabled a concentrated focus on learning Bahasa, and provided space for local languages, thereby promoting regional and ethnic cultures and identities. For others, it has disadvantaged young people and the nation, holding it back from potential economic and political advancement. However, the continued impact of globalisation, as well as Indonesia's own ambition to become a more prominent regional and international political player, means that there is a growing parental and community expectation, demand for English in all levels of education. English has high prestige, as we know, particularly amongst business and youth groups, and it features prominently in domains such as technology, science, and popular culture. Yet there is a problem. While there is a clear desire for English as a lingua franca for international engagement and economic advancement, there is also a view that English is associated with Western culture, and that this may pose a threat to Indonesian cultural values, knowledges, and identities, particularly important for unifying a nation state and an archipelago state as well. So what is Indonesia to do? Well, for the most part, what happens is that English is treated largely as though it's culturally neutral. That is, as an international language, it somehow doesn't belong to any particular nation or any particular culture. Hence, curricula and resources, teacher training and programs in universities largely frame English through communication skills, listening, speaking, reading and writing, and some combination of those. And there's little attention to culture. This more functional orientation presents English as a tool, an instrument that can be performed with little or no impact or connection to one's identity, somehow removed from its cultural context. This view may work to some extent, however, there are also problems with it. For example, as there is no such thing as neutral English, I would argue, there's immediately a question about whose English is chosen. Or will it be a selection of different Englishes? Will it include other varieties such as Singlish or Aboriginal English? So, there's a real question around what kind of English, whose English, and who has the authority to decide. There are also questions about teacher proficiency, because if the language can't be taught with reference to its cultural context, how do teachers develop the depth of proficiency and the understandings to teach language effectively? Then there are questions that flow into resources and, of course, assessment, which I won't go into today. That would require a whole nother paper. But there are problems you can see at every stage with this view. There are also problems of learner engagement, and I hear this a lot. Poor engagement, poor motivation to learn English, because somehow writing a composition or translating a 19th century US poet isn't that engaging for young Indonesians in the lives that they're leading. So in an attempt to separate English from its cultural context, to potentially avoid cultural influence in Indonesia, there are certainly other consequences that impact on the quality and the potential uniqueness of English in Indonesia. So let me outline how we might rethink English in Indonesia towards a more meaningful and culturally sensitive orientation. Oh, apologies, I should have moved that. Okay, so for over 20 years now in Australia, we've been moving towards an intercultural orientation, and I'll just call it that for short, because it's a big mouthful to say multilingual and intercultural, but each time I say, if you can think about it as multilingual and intercultural. So this orientation emerged from a recognition in Australia of the changing goals of language education towards a bilingual or a multilingual norm. That is, for second or additional language learners, the goal of learning to become native speaker-like was not only extremely difficult given the context of programs in the Australian context, but it was actually not reasonable. And I think this is well beyond Australia, but certainly we saw it very sharply in our context. A language learner in an instructional setting with limited exposure to the target language, this is particularly the case in our school programs in Australia, but also in our university programs, cannot develop sufficient proficiency in the time and the resources available, certainly not high-level proficiency. Furthermore, these learners are not enculturated into the language and cultural envelope like native speakers are. Hence, it was not achievable to become a native speaker without the life experiences of native speakers. So, you can't, what we're saying here is that native speakers are enculturated, they are grown, they grow up, they form their whole language repertoire, their whole cultural framework in a first language, or at least in other languages bilingually, in a way that a second language learner or a learner of the language as an additional language really can't replicate. So it's not reasonable to expect them to use language and have the proficiency in the same way. And which native speakers would we hold up anyway as the norm? British English, American English, Canadian English, Australian English, and so on. So again, we've got the issue of which variety is the desired native speaker. And so scholars like Claire Cramsch, Vivian Cook, and others, these just to name a few, have really challenged the whole native speaker paradigm and indicated that we might move towards a bilingual or a multilingual norm to be more fruitful for second and additional language learners. And this very much resonated with our context in Australia. And I would think would have some value in Indonesia, and the recognition that learners are already bringing at least one other language and culture to them when they come to education. So there's always a language that they bring and the language that they're learning. So there's always these two languages and cultures in relation to each other. And this means that in the learning process, they automatically make connections. They can't help it. They're already referencing, as soon as they learn something new, they're thinking about, oh, well, that's unusual, or why is it that way? Or, oh, that connects a little bit with the language I already know. So they're constantly making these connections, thinking about how the language works, thinking about the sounds of the language, and building up their repertoire in the new language. And as Vivian Cook told us way back in 2005, if you can see behind my head here, that these learners are developing what's called a multi-competence. They are learning not only the language, learning to be proficient in the language, but they are referencing and moving across their languages with a kind of competence of understanding and awareness of how language itself works, how meaning works, how language and culture also work. And Claire Cramsch takes this even further and says that we need to have a kind of symbolic competence. This is more recent thinking that says it's not just using the language, understanding how language works, but she says we also need to be able to use it powerfully and use it politically to impact others and to present ourselves in the way we want to in the world. So in Australia, the work we've been doing is around this intercultural orientation. And the central idea is that learners, language learners who are learning an additional language, learn to move between, that's the inter part, the movement between the two languages and cultures at least. Some of our students are coming to school already with 3 or 4 languages, and certainly to university. But recognising that the people you're interacting with may not necessarily share the same linguistic and cultural framework or the same values, the same worldviews and so on. And it's learning to navigate that, learning to mediate or move between in order to make sense with each other. So in this sense, we can sort of liken mediation to like a kind of translation of one's language and culture for another, but not translation in the traditional sense. It's not just code work or moving, one set of code and ideas into another, but it's actually trying to represent meaning across a linguistic and cultural system that is not necessarily shared in the same way. And so learners are trying to use the language resource that they're building up, that they're developing, and they have to try and use that to give maximum meaning to the person they're interacting with or their interlocutor. And I recall one of my PhD students, Chondro Alim, who was at Purwokerto. He was actually doing work in translation studies, and he was looking at trying to translate from Australian English, and he was looking at the term underdog. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard this term, but it is one word that we use in Australia to try and represent, and I can't do it justice in the time, it's trying to represent the idea that somehow you're at a disadvantage to a more powerful group. It's used a lot in sports events, it's used a lot in political domains, but it's this idea that you are somehow, not as even or not as strong as the other party. Now, Chondro spent 4 pages of his PhD trying to explain this one word, because of course there is no equivalent in Indonesian. Orang kecil doesn't do it, orang pinggiran doesn't do it, and so he tried to work around trying to get across the meaning of this one word, underdog. And this is what we mean by this intercultural work, trying to convey meaning for another in order for them to get the maximum sense of what you're talking about. So there are implications of this orientation that go through all aspects of teaching practice, resources and so on. But I don't have time to go into all of that. Certainly we've written a lot about it, and I can point you to those references if you're interested. But what I want to do is just briefly share with you a set of principles that we work with in doing this work that hopefully will be of some use for you to begin thinking about this way of language teaching and learning. And it is a whole orientation. It is a kind of a mindset that you bring to language teaching that affects every aspect of practice. And so you'll see here, I've just put in bold the key term of the principles, but let me just briefly speak to each one. How am I going for time, Arham? Okay, yeah. Another 10 minutes or so.
I'm sorry?
Another 10 minutes or so?
I think we still have about 20 minutes, yeah?
Okay.
20 minutes, including just question and answers now.
Right. Okay, so let's just look at these principles very briefly. So first of all, we have the multiplicity, multilingual multiplicity. It is the idea of working with multiple. Arham, could you? Yeah, bagus. So this principle, I'm still getting echo, yeah? This principle recognises that in all aspects of practice, learners are bringing at least one other language and culture. So we're working with 2, so it's multi, yeah? They're learning the new language, for example, English, while also drawing on their existing language resource, be that Javanese or Sundanese, Chinese, whatever. This principle also involves learning to appreciate diverse perspectives, multiple perspectives, being able to take a different position on something, and knowing that everyone is coming from somewhere when they communicate. We are all positioned somehow in the languages and cultures that we know and use. So when we can also encourage the use of multiple texts that show diverse perspectives. So not just any single text, even though I'm going to do that today in the interest of time, but normally I would use a range of texts to bring in different perspectives, sometimes perspectives that don't agree, sometimes perspectives that are deliberately diverse, to try and encourage learners to see things from different angles. It could in English mean using text from Canada or Singapore or New Zealand or wherever, from the English-speaking world, to try and bring in these diverse perspectives. The next principle is that language learning is embodied. There are real-life people attached to these languages, and we need to recognise that. So as learners have these experiences across different languages and cultures, they develop interpretive frames that help them understand the new language and culture, and that are the basis for them acting in their language. And this means that teachers need to attend to the learners themselves. I know we use this a lot. We say, we must know who our learners are, what their needs and interests are. This is particularly so, and we would go beyond saying needs and interests and say you actually need to understand their linguistic and cultural repertoire. What is the language capability that they have? What is their understanding of language and culture? How are they making sense? How are they interpreting? Because that gives you a basis for building on the new learning. And so this is really linked to the idea of personalising learning. Really, I heard Prof. Judith saying earlier, you've got to know your learners, and you really do. We can't stress that enough. I know that is hard when you have large classes, but we need some really interesting ways, including diagnostic assessment, that helps us understand how the learners are making sense in their learning. It's not just their needs and interests, but it is also their capacity that they have and the ways that they make sense. And so we need to invite different interpretations. Not all of our students will see things in the same way, and that's actually okay. And that's part of the understanding, the broader understanding of diversity that students learn. And so, we need to explore with them, well, if you see it this way, why do you think that is? What is it in your background, in your experience, that has shaped your view? And then let's compare that and look across the class and see how different people are interpreting differently, potentially because of their languages and cultures. And so we need to present students with ideas, texts, resources, stimulus for learning that actually connects with them and their life worlds. Because talking about hamburgers for a group of students from Kupang who have never seen a hamburger, don't even know what this idea is, as one of my master's students found out, it really just didn't cut it. The students were not that interested in talking about hamburgers when it was not part of their life world or their experiences at all. Next principle is that learning needs to be conceptual. And so this is the idea that we have to have something to language about. We've got to use language to talk about our world and talk about ideas. And this is where we go into something, potentially quite rich and quite meaningful. One of my PhD students, again, from Indonesia, Billy Setiawan, you may have seen he's been writing in The Conversation Indonesia, and he's been doing a study about intercultural language learning in the Indonesian context. And one of the ideas, the concepts that he used was the concept of fusion. And he's found this to be particularly valuable for students because really these young Indonesians who he's been working with are living a kind of fused life. They're very urbanized in Jakarta, and they are really, learning to navigate these diverse worlds that they're in, traditional, modern, Eastern, Western, and so on. We could tease out many dimensions. But concepts such as community or freedom, respect, what some of these big ideas are that travel across cultures, but they look quite different and they are talked about in different sorts of ways. And this would form a basis, I believe, for really working through cultural values and putting on the table Indonesian cultural values as well, not just those that come with English. The next principle is that learning is interactive. Language learning is interactive. I'm not telling you anything new here, but I just want to emphasize the fact that what this means is if we recognize that you have to talk to learn language or interact to learn language, then we have to interact in our pedagogy in certain ways with students. And so it means that teachers have a role in encouraging interaction, inviting students to notice, what do you see here? How do you understand this? What kind of interpretation do you have? And to ask them to explain their views, and then compare, question, critically question where these views come from and so on. So we might need to encourage students to adopt new positions, to see something from a slightly different angle, with questions such as, how might you react to this if you were so-and-so, or if you took this view instead? And so this kind of pedagogy also means we need to use a lot more authentic texts. I think this is a really important point, because authentic texts are made for, the community of users of that language, not necessarily for education purposes, but just to get the work done of communicating in that language. And so these authentic texts carry meanings that can be quite culturally interesting. And they're not just contrived kinds of texts that are used for grammar practice, which a lot of textbooks are. And finally, we have, two more principles, reflective and reflexive. Now, really, if we don't have reflection, we don't have the intercultural, because reflection asks us to stand back a little bit from the detail and think about what's happened, to consider the experiences that we have, and to think about, well, why was that the case? What happened when I was trying to communicate and it didn't quite work, or it worked much better than I expected? And so the reflection principle is really, really important for students to understand their experiences in communicating, understand their own role in communicating, and the interaction with others in communicating, and how it came to be that meaning was developed as it did. And finally, the developmental principle. This is really just one that recognises that language learning as an intercultural endeavour is a lifelong endeavour. It takes time. It's based on multiple experiences over time. As we have different kinds of experiences, we build up this resource and this meta awareness of who we are linguistically and culturally, and who others are as we interact with them. It's also an opportunity for people to think about how well this language and culture fits with them. And this is what I think Indonesia might consider around English. How well does English sit with us? What aspects of it do we want to take? Which ones don't we want to take? And that may be different for individuals, for communities, and for the nation. And so I would just want to share with you briefly a little example, just to give you a taste of what I'm talking about. So I'm calling this learning to mean. I think this is the central idea around intercultural language teaching and learning, is that it really is all about how we mean, and how we mean across languages and cultures, and convey our meanings and share our meanings together. So I asked my students only a few weeks ago, these were applied linguistics students, not necessarily English language students or language learners, but I asked them to think about this text. Now, you may not have followed the World Cup, excuse me, but it was held in Australia, and the Australian team, known as the Matildas, featured very prominently, let me say, probably much more. They were a bit of the underdog, actually, if I go back to that idea. We weren't expecting to win, but they did a lot better than expected. And so there was a big following in Australia of this team. Now, I asked my students to tell me about this text. What could they see? What sense could they make of? Now, the international students, about half my class was international students, and they said things like, oh, we know it's a party, it's soccer, we've heard that term, but the rest of the world calls it football, so we don't quite know why Australia calls it this. There's a big screen, so it's probably a big television, and so on. They were able to point out some of the key points. But my domestic students, the local students, they of course could bring a lot more of the cultural side of things to the learning, and they explained things like the colours. The green and yellow, the green and gold are the national colours of Australia. They represent the wheat and the grasslands and so on, the landscape of Australia. They talked about the name Matildas, Matilda, which comes from a very old poem that is the basis of, a lot of a lot of Australian thinking around waltzing Matilda, a lot of history associated with our English heritage and so on. And so the local students were able to unfold or unpack a lot of the cultural meaning that is going on in this text, more than just the surface meaning. So they were able to go a lot deeper in this. And there was a big exchange in the classroom then around, what all of these things might mean and how you could understand them. So this is a tiny example, and I could explain, I don't have time, but I could explain how the different principles are at work here in terms of personalising the learning, in terms of working through concepts, interaction, and so on. So if we start to think that there might be something in this for Indonesia, what would it actually mean? Let me turn to implications now. So firstly, rethinking English language teaching with an intercultural orientation might mean that Indonesia would need to rethink its goals of English language education. It would mean developing a policy that starts with a bilingual norm or a multilingual norm rather than this thinking towards a native speaker English norm. And it's not becoming a native speaker of English, but rather a kind of Indonesian English, especially for the majority of learners, I would say. I think there would need to still be a specialist stream if you wanted high-level disciplinary English proficiency. That would, an ESP or an EMI kind of stream, you would still need to have that in the disciplines where you wanted that, but a sort of more GE stream could really, benefit from this orientation. It would mean that the policy would need to focus on all aspects of language education, English language education, teacher training, curriculum that is developed locally rather than imported, as many curricula are, and textbooks and material that are developed locally and that reflect young Indonesians' life worlds, the kinds of contexts that they live in, the kinds of purposes that they want to use English for, and not just context borrowed from overseas. So in this way, English would have a place, not just as a tool, but maybe one day, if young Indonesians were to travel and do business overseas, that wouldn't be the goal. It potentially could be, but rather it would be as a resource. English becomes a resource for participating in local communities as well as a global community. English, in this sense, English could become Indonesianified, if that's a possible word. It becomes localized, in other words, with new terminologies, new meanings that are specific to the Indonesian context. And it means that concerns about English culture infiltrating Indonesian cultural values or somehow replacing Indonesian cultural values is less pressing, because Indonesia will decide what it wants to take. It would decide what fits well with Indonesia and what doesn't with its own cultural framework. So this would mean a shift in the status of English rather than becoming a lingua franca, spreading potentially Anglo-American culture in the main, or Anglo-British culture in the main, for the purposes of transactional communication. It would mean seeing English as a starting point for interaction, a valid means for communicating with others for whom English is an additional language. In this way, English is not an invading language, but rather it is appropriated by learners to serve their purposes, to make sense in their life worlds and local contexts. It also means that English can be usurped, it can be challenged, it can be used in creative ways that might resist its dominance. So to draw my talk to a close this morning, let me conclude by saying that Indonesia has a complex relationship with English. While it desires it on the one hand for international engagement, rightly so, and trade and so on, it is also wary of it for its potential change and influence on Indonesian cultural values and identity. Contemporary understandings of languages education provide a basis for reconsidering the teaching and learning of English in Indonesia, reorienting the goals towards a bilingual or a multilingual norm would shift the focus from the native speaker of English as the desired outcome towards diverse speakers of English as the norm. Furthermore, an intercultural orientation places students at the centre, who they are, what's important to them, what sort of meanings they want to make and share, and so on. An intercultural orientation positions the students as go-betweens, these people who can move across and move between languages and cultures. Not just acquiring a body of knowledge in order to, transact, but learning to make meaning for themselves, with others, and including diverse others, users of English. And in this way, English is less about importing the world to Indonesia. It's less about bringing English in and more about using English to represent Indonesia to the world. So I will leave it there. Hopefully I haven't talked too fast, and there are some questions that people might have. So terima kasih atas perhatian Anda.
Thank you very much for your expertly delivered, inspiring, and resourceful presentation, Michelle. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, now we've come to the question and answer session. However, because of time, unfortunately, we can only probably accept one question, yeah? Sorry about that.
Maaf,
Tidak apa-apa.
terlalu panjang.
Okay, maybe I would like to question from our senior lecturer, Pak Haidir. Pak Haidir, silakan. Boleh di. Okay.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity. Hello, Michelle.
Hi.
Let me ask you, in Indonesia, school children learn English, but they don't use it in conversation. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So we do not, even all teachers do not speak English in daily life. And the second one, we need more English native speakers. Without English native speakers, our English unnatural, not natural. How about your comment? Thank you.
Right. Pak Arham, could you maybe drop the slideshow down and then we can just see the gallery?
Okay, yes.
Right. Okay, yeah, look, lovely question, because I don't want to suggest that we don't use native speakers, or we don't, we somehow only have an English within Indonesia. I mean, that would not make sense, yeah? But what I'm suggesting is that we open up to a range of speakers of English, that we actually, part of the project for Indonesia is learning that there are English varieties and there are some legitimate other forms of English out there in the world. In fact, most of the world are speakers of English as a second or an additional language. So first I would say, yes, you need native speakers, but you need them as part of a series, a panorama of representations of English. Yeah, most of what young Indonesians are going to engage with is speakers for whom English is an additional or foreign language. Yeah, and so we want to normalize that and say it is okay. I heard someone earlier, I forget who it was, saying, apologies for my English. Yes, we want to improve, we want to increase proficiency, of course we do. We always want, better quality language. But we also have to see that what we are doing is building up a repertoire and being able to use that with other speakers of language. So the biggest challenge for our learners is actually learning to navigate these different kinds of Englishes across different language and cultural backgrounds, because most of whom they will interact with will be speakers for whom English is not their first language. Yeah, and that's why we want to encourage even those in younger years, our children, we want to give them opportunities to use English with each other. First and foremost, that's their immediate world. They need some purposeful ways to use English, and that's okay. It doesn't have to only be when there's a native speaker around. Yeah. So we need some creative ways, some creative purposes for them to talk about things that matter to them in and through English, and then learn how to, how to make meaning with English, with meanings that they actually care about, because talking about hamburgers isn't going to do it. Yeah. I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah. So yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Michelle. Hi, dear. Okay. The community just let me know that we still have time for one question. Okay. So perhaps from our students here, Sutanti. Okay. We may ask your question.
Yes. Good morning, miss.
Sutanti, yeah.
Okay. Hello.
Yes. Good morning. Good morning, miss.
Good morning.
Yes. First of all, I'm so sorry for my English, which is not very good. And
Jangan
my
malu,
question
ya. Jangan malu. This is the thing about being a bilingual, being a multilingual. You are adding, expanding, increasing. It's not a deficit. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, miss. Okay, my question is, in our daily conversation, we usually mix Indonesian language and English. So, do you think is that a good way to learn English, or will it be a problem in the future? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Look, this is a lovely question, really important, and there's a lot of work going on around the world in what is called translanguaging, or meshing languages, mixing languages, hybrid forms of languages, and so on. Now, translanguaging came out of bilingual education. It was seen, well, originally this mixing was seen as a problem, some sort of interference in the learning process. However, we have come to understand through many research studies now that translanguaging, this idea of bridging meaning, of weaving together languages to make meaning, is actually a very natural part of language use and very important in language learning. And so we understand that this practice actually is necessary for the bridging that needs to happen in order for higher level proficiency to develop. So the idea that you just stay in one language only and it's absolutely fixed and set and you never refer to your other language is really quite a sort of a problematic idea. Increasingly, we understand that for additional language learners, this practice of translanguaging, weaving together, is very, very important. Now, I wouldn't say that that is the only thing that we aspire to. Of course, we want high level proficiency also in one language. So it's a big ask here that we're trying to do with language learning. For most people, this idea in Indonesia, young people will do this translanguaging, this mixing of languages, multiple languages. We know, we've seen that in the research. But we also need some of those people, not everyone I would say, but some of those people to move to a high level of proficiency in the language, because we do want them to be able to, conduct speeches or business or whatever. But not everyone is going to need to do that. And so I would say, yes, translanguaging and using it as a pedagogy for language learning for most people, but also, and this is where it comes back to policy, we also need some of those people to be able to go on to much higher levels of proficiency in specialised discipline areas. Yeah. So I hope that's okay.
Okay, yeah. I hope it's clear. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Michelle, for your answers. And because the time is up, so I think we finally come to the end of the second session. I believe that Michelle's presentation has given us much food for thought for the advancement of English language teaching and learning in our beloved country, Indonesia. Yeah. Therefore, on behalf of everyone here, I would like to give you a token of our appreciation in the form as a certificate. So before we close this session, please allow me to symbolically hand over the certificate. Okay. And also to document this occasion, let's take a screenshot. Yeah? All right. On my
Terima
count.
kasih.
1, 2, 3. Yes. Okay, it's done? All right. Okay, dear Michelle, it's been an honor for us to have you as one of the keynote speakers at this conference. Yeah. So again, thank you very much, and we hope to see you again in the future, particularly to discuss about assessment and other things. Yeah.
Happy to. And sorry if I spoke too long and didn't allow enough time for questions.
Yeah,
but
no problem.
if we have
Maybe
questions,
next time.
yeah, kirim email saja ya.
Yeah. Or maybe you can even visit us here at Siliwangi next time you go to Bandung again. Yeah.
I would love to. I haven't been since COVID, so yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, terima kasih semua.
Sama-sama. Terima kasih. Thank you very much.
Sampai jumpa lagi.
Sampai jumpa lagi. Okay, finally, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention, and back to our host, Patrice. Have a nice day, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Well, thank you very much, Parham and Michelle, for a very amazing presentation. A lot of things we learned. The last question about translanguaging, explanation about that was very, very interesting. So that was very amazing. Thanks. And then next, we also going to have another session with Dr. O'Boyle from Queen's University of Belfast. But before that, we are going to have a special performance for everyone from our student in English Students Education Study Program. So ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the show of the art performance from English Students Association's Siliwangi.